First, we'll have our invocation of Pastor Tommy Shepard, Stewart Church of Living Water.
Let's pray together. Loving God, we thank you, Lord, for a beautiful day. Lord, you're good to us. And as we come together tonight, I just pray an outpouring of your Spirit upon this building, upon this room, upon all who are here. We pray, oh God, for understanding, for clarity of mind in making decisions. And I pray for each and every one of the supervisors, oh Lord, as they consider decisions that must be made, that your Spirit would direct. For I pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Next, we'll have our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next, we'll have a moment of silence for all of our U.S. military serving here and abroad and all public safety. Thank you. All right, next item on the agenda is approval of meeting agenda. Are there any amendments? I hear a motion to approve.
I move that we approve the agenda.
I have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Call for vote. Mr. Marshall?
Aye.
Mr. Kendrick?
Aye.
Mr. Wood?
Aye.
Mr. Perry?
Aye.
I vote aye as well. Motion carries. Next item is new business. Mr. Kyle, I want to pronounce that wrong. Lokes, okay. Mr. Kyle Lokes, Davenport and Company Financial Analysis.
Chair, members of the board will get up here, and I guess I'll sit here if that's all right. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. And I think there's going to be a presentation up on the screen for the folks in the audience, and then for the board, it's the exact same thing you have in front of you. So we'll give that a second. But again, Kyle Laux with Davenport. We've had the good fortune of serving as the county's financial advisor for a number of years. I think the last time we were here is about 2018, and so it's been a little while. And certainly we appreciate that. We work with many of your peers and neighbors right in this neighborhood and across the state, and we always appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to the board and give you hopefully a little bit of helpful insights as you're moving into the budget process really for FY 2025. And so what you see up on the screen, and it looks like that might be the draft, but that's probably fine. I don't think we made any material changes. But what you see up on the screen is what we call a comprehensive financial review. And so our sort of, call it our mission here is to give the board, in terms of a big picture sense, knowing you're about to go into the sausage making process of the budget, hopefully give a little bit of a perspective on the overall financial health of the county. And that's something we've done for many of your peers for a number of years. No decisions need to be made today, but give you a little bit of perspective, some recommendations in terms of policies and things. We've got a nice history with the county, and so as I said, we've been here a little while. It's been a couple years since we've been in front of you as a board. We've got a little bit of the perspective on the past, and we're excited really in terms of where you are as a county right now. We think there's a lot of positives here that we'll just underscore in terms of the details. I'd also say, Mr. Chair, members of the board, if you have questions as we go through all this, so there's a bunch of pages, I'll try and move relatively quickly, but I'm happy to take them as we go. So in terms of the background and approach, I think this is really kind of already covered, so we can go to the next page in terms of our goals and objectives. So what we want to do is a little bit in terms of number one, we're going to look at some history. History is a good precursor for maybe what's coming into the future. Give a sense of the trends on the financial side of the house over the last 5 or so fiscal years. We'll kind of cut to the chase there, and that you've had very positive trends over the last 5 or so years. That 2018 time period, just coincidentally, is about 5 years ago. That was really, in fairness, the low point in terms of fund balance, some real challenges in the county. But since that time period, we've seen very steady trends of much more financial strength. We'll talk about that in detail, but just want to highlight that as we start talking here. We'll throw in some peer comparatives. I think it's always helpful to kind of see what your neighbors and other counties, both in the immediate region and maybe a little bit outside, are doing, and so we'll give you some of that. The existing debt profile of the county, just kind of give you a sense of that. We're also going to make some recommendations in here as you look at item number 2 in terms of some financial policies. And so we'll talk about some specific financial policies that would be our recommendation to you as a board to consider adopting around fund balance and reserves and debt levels. So we can talk about some additional detail, but those tend to be the cornerstone from a good financial planning standpoint of what we would recommend to you consider as you go through into the budget process. At the end of the book, we'll talk about, we've put in here a capital funding analysis, I think really to give you an order of magnitude sense for the moment. We know there's a number of things that, in terms of capital needs or priorities, that whether it's now or in the future will be discussed, at some point will be needed. And so I wanted to give you an order of magnitude of what some of that might look like at a couple different ranges in terms of capital investment. We'll get to that at the back of the book. So we wanted to start at, I guess, page 5 here and just give a little bit of big picture perspective in terms of the demographic trends that we've seen. Not necessarily directly within your control as a board, but we see some very nice trends here, and so we wanted to highlight that to you. So again, we'll compare to your neighbors and peers. We mentioned obviously the demographics aren't directly within your control, but I think part of what you're likely going to be a lot focused on is economic development. And so those types of economic development initiatives over the long term certainly can help and improve those demographics. Unemployment rate, the lowest in basically a decade, and the median household income has grown very substantially, at least via the numbers that we found in the Census Bureau. So I think if we flip to the next page, just give you a little more specifics here on page 7. I mentioned a peer group, and so we've tried to grab some of your neighbors and peers, obviously other counties across the southwestern portion of the state. We'll see on the next page here, we've tried to grab folks that are plus or minus in our population range. So everybody's a little different, has their own specifics, but tried to grab a group of people that are generally representative of the size of county and thus the size of maybe the budget and the types of challenges and opportunities. And so just tried to give you that sense. So for our population right now in Patrick County is about 17,000. You see that peer group median is about 20,000. So we're right in around that range. Dickinson on the smaller side, up to Tazewell on the bigger side. You can see that kind of diversity there. So if you go to the next page, here is the unemployment rate. We thought this was a very nice positive trend. Clearly we had the spike with the pandemic that across the board for everybody created that anomaly in the 2020 time period, but to be at 3.6% in terms of the unemployment rate for the county, you are tied with the state, just a smidge above Virginia, but clearly a nice positive trend. It's the second lowest in terms of that unemployment rate that you've seen in the last decade. So it's good to see, and something you're obviously going to be thinking about on the economic development standpoint. In terms of comparative, you're right at the peer group median. You can see that if We're at the bottom there, Patrick County 3.6%. The peer group's about 3.7%. You have your Floyds and your Gileses tend to get a little more spillover from maybe the Virginia Tech area. So if you maybe kind of put those aside as a bit of a anomaly, we're really right there in line with everybody else, and arguably on the low side when you take out some of those folks. Page 11, median household income. This is a very nice trend to see. And again, this is just data we're pulling. We don't necessarily create this. But I think if you look at the both 5 and 10-year, what's called a compound average growth rate. That's a funny acronym at the bottom, the CAGR. It's kind of an awkward acronym, but that's basically on average, how much is that median household income growing over the last 5 and 10 years. And you've seen you've sort of experienced very nice growth. The 5-year has been growing on average 5%. That's, per these numbers, higher than both the state and the nation. If you look at a little bit longer time period, you're still growing at about 3.9. I might take a little liberty there and just round it up to 4%. So you're seeing some of those demographic trends, a nice average annual increase in terms of the median household income. You can see on a comparative basis where you stand. You are above that peer group median. And again, when you take the Giles and the Floyds, both of which we work with and know really well, you take a little bit of maybe the Virginia Tech direct impact out of Giles and Floyd, and you look at the rest of that graph, you're very much in line and really on the high side, second highest of that entire peer group in terms of median household income. So with that as a little bit of maybe big picture background in terms of the demographics, we'll talk some more about the tax base, some of your current tax rates, and see where you compare. Assessed values remain stable. It's been growing a little bit in recent years. We'll look at that. Your assessed value per capita. So basically one of the measurements that we look at and really outside, whether it's rating agencies or lenders, we'll look at is what is our total tax base, meaning our assessed value relative to the population. Knowing that our primary revenue source is that property tax base, how much is there relative to the population that you need to support as a local government? Your particular ratio is on the high side, looks pretty good, and it's been improving, and so we'll talk about that. Real estate tax rate, just a smidge above the peer group median, but you've got other tax rates that are below the peer group median. So when you kind of look at it in the totality, you're very much competitive with your peers in the region. And so we'll talk about some of that in the next couple pages. On page 15, this is just a historical trend of the assessed value. We went back 10 years here. And I think if you take your eye to the top of that table, you see the tail end of the 08-09 financial crisis and recession that had a long tail to it in terms of tax base and revenues and the economy. And so you start that picture basically 10 years ago with a tax base that was at the time still shrinking a bit by virtue of a variety of things, a lot of that like 08-09 financial overhang. And then we went through a number of years where it was kind of stable. And now what we're starting to see, not in great numbers yet, but starting to see kind of an uptick in terms of those values last couple years. So we've been largely steady over that whole 10-year time period, but I think what's nice to see is that we are almost back to just a smidge below the level of the total assessed value where we were about 10 years ago. So it's taken a little while to kind of catch back up. We know there's a reassessment that'll be coming up. Those have been, we know it's not this budget cycle, but have been very, very important for a number of your peers across the state in terms of the reassessment cycle. So we'll get to that later. But we just wanted to give you the sense here of the relative stability in terms of the tax base over the last decade and some growth. The total assessed value, just compared to your peers here, if we're a smidge below about $2 billion, the peer group median is just a smidge above that. got some outliers in the Tazwells and the Ys, but right in line in terms of the total assessed value. I think if we go to the next page, we'll throw in our population here. But again, maybe one of our relative challenges is that decline over that time period in terms of the population, something that, is maybe outside of your direct day-to-day control, but we're aware of it and kind of watch and see, and maybe some of that economic development can help with some of those kind of things. But largely within, between 18,000 and about 17,000 or thereabouts per the latest numbers here. What that translates to, though, is, as I mentioned at the outset, a strong assessed value per capita. So the total size of that tax base relative to the size of the population that is your taxpayers in terms of the county, this has been a strong number. And so at about 116,000, anything above 100,000 is generally viewed as pretty positive. And so you're about 116,000 or thereabouts. That's a strong number, and we'll see that on the next page on a comparative basis. And so to that end, our assessed value per capita, again, peer group median is at about 112. We're at 116. Take a couple of the outliers out, and we're right in line with that peer group median. So good, solid level relative to our neighbors. Real estate tax rate on page 20 here, just to kind of give you that history. I think what the county has done, and it's easy for us to say, sort of sitting in this seat, but what you've done as a county to kind of get the finances reset in the last 4 or 5 years from that 2018 time period, as we see the numbers come through in your audits annually, the reserves, the fund balance, et cetera, has gone a long way to giving you a good, stable base and really a positive momentum, at least as we see it going forward. So we know it's partially reflected here in terms of real estate tax rate. It's budget season, and so we wanted to point that out. But knowing that, this board, prior boards had to do a lot to kind of get things reset, just want to give the kudos there where it's deserved. You can see comparatively where you are. Again, a little bit on the higher side relative to that peer group. But again, if you take out some of the low-end outliers there, especially the coal counties that tend to have relatively lower real estate tax rates, they're getting some of that coal severance tax that funds various things depending on the county, but that's a unique revenue source for like the Tazwells, the Buchanans, et cetera, that ends up kind of resetting their real estate rate lower than otherwise would be. So outside of them, we're sort of right in the range there of others. Then you flip the page, personal property tax, you're below the peer group median, so at $1.71. The peers are above $2. And so that's one where you're actually below in terms of the peer comparative, the tax rates there. Meals tax, you're right at 4% there, which is the peer group median. The nice thing about a meals tax is there's a kind of built-in inflationary measure to it, and so as you go out to eat, and if you have families, et cetera, I know I do, and you go out and you're at McDonald's or Burger King, and it just sort of costs a little bit more every time you go right now. It's not any fun, but from the county side of things, the revenue you're getting off of a tax like that, it's discretionary in terms of folks don't have to go out to eat if they want to, but they certainly do. And there's kind of a built-in inflationary adjustment there. So as the price of a Big Mac goes up, so too does the revenue associated with it in terms of the meals tax. Similar to the transient occupancy tax, if I could spit that all out. We're right there at the peer group median at 5%. This is another obviously very nice revenue source for you with the unique situation with Primland, et cetera. I think this generates about $140,000 or thereabouts in terms of annual revenue, and so it gives you a nice comparative advantage relative to other folks. And so that, again, just a little bit of background, just give you some perspective in terms of where you are, very competitive relative to your peers. And so with that, we'll transition into talking about the general fund and show you some of these trends and give you some more specifics in terms of why we see some positives in your finances. So key takeaways, the general fund's produced a surplus 5 out of the past 6 fiscal years. That's certainly different than the prior 5 years, and so we want to make sure we point that out. We'll give you a visual just to kind of paint a picture of kind of the prior 5 years versus the immediately preceding 5 years, and just give you that sense. There have been some, call it one-time or limited time revenues that have helped that. And so via the Federal Stimulus Act, the ARPA dollars, et cetera, you've been able to help bolster the reserves. That's been a big positive to you. I think one of our messages for everybody right now in this budget cycle is it's really the first budget cycle that local governments are going through within the last several years, whereby the ARPA dollars are spoken for, the other special federal stimulus monies are really gone. And so this FY25 budget cycle is very, very important in terms of getting reset with what are our recurring annual revenues, taking aside the sort of special one-time federal projects relative to our annual recurring expenditures. So it's the first time some of that noise, so to speak, in the finances won't be there. And so we think it's really, really important as you work on this FY25 budget to get a good, what we call structurally balanced budget, whereby the recurring revenues are covering the recurring expenditures, factoring out all this kind of, call it, special one-time events of the last several years. So pages 27, 28, lots of numbers, tried to kind of maybe boil this down into some graphs for you. But in terms of the growth in revenues, you can see property taxes is our single biggest revenue line item. Out of a total of about 24 million of recurring revenues, that accounts for about 16 million or thereabouts. It's been growing on average about 4.5% a year. So that's, kind of generally keeping up with inflation over that time period, but certainly inflation has picked up substantially the last several years. You can see some really, really nice growth in the other local taxes line item. That is skewed a little bit in a positive way by the special 1% sales tax for schools. And so that's within that number. We'll break it out a little bit more on the next page, but just want to point that out. A very nice positive that you have, as you probably know, other local governments right now are trying to work through with the General Assembly to give themselves the ability and the authority that you as a county already have. And so you're kind of a step ahead in terms of that. And so I just point that out in terms of the other local taxes. That $1.5 million, $1.7 million or thereabouts that we get from that is built into that number. On page 28, you see that broken out a little bit more. The sales and use tax, we tried to put that in kind of a blue box there. You can see how it was trending, $1.1 million, $1.3 million in 2020, and then suddenly it pops to $3 million in 2022. So that jump or that increase in FY 2022 is partially attributable to that new sales tax for schools, running at about $1.5 million, $1.7 million a year. And so I just want to point that out as a nice positive that you have as a tool. On page 29, in terms of expenditures, those have been growing at a slower pace than the revenues have. But I think, again, our maybe a little bit cautionary note here as you enter the FY25 budget is it'll be, again, the first budget without the ARPA dollars, without the other special, on the school side, they had ESSER funds, sort of their equivalent of ARPA. And so this will really be the first year that all the budgets need to get kind of reset for what do we have as a local government in terms of recurring revenues versus recurring expenditures. And so we just point that out. So page 30, this is maybe in terms of the historical financials, the most important page in here. And we tried to use some visuals here, but the graph at the top or maybe middle of the page, that's looking back 10 years. And so we mentioned that the last 5 years have been very positive. The 5 years before that, where the county really struggled on the cash flow side of things. And so we've highlighted that with, kind of a red circle there. But basically what you're seeing is the light green bars are our revenues. The red line there is our expenditures. And so if you look at that from 2014 to 2018, that green bar with the revenues is below the expenditures. And so as we flip the next couple pages, we're going to see a corresponding decrease in our fund balance of our reserves. The nice part, and one of the reasons we're excited to be here today, given what we'll call maybe phase 2 for you as Patrick County, is you then go look at 2019 to 2023, and the exact opposite is happening. And so your revenues, again represented by the bars, are tracking above your expenditures. And so you have a very nice positive momentum. You've got positive annual cash flow, running surpluses, getting back to a structurally balanced budget, and you've been able to rebuild your reserves such that we really see ourselves hopefully out of the woods in terms of some of the revenue anticipation notes that we had to rely on as a county a number of years ago, kind of a payday loan in that sense, moving beyond some of the reworking of the existing debt that had to be done to kind of make things work back in the 2017, 2018 time period. Really hopeful that we're very much out of the woods there. But certainly want to make sure we're mindful of it, and speaking to you as the board going into FY25, that again, we think it's important to make sure that as that budget is set, the recurring revenues at least equal the recurring expenditures, and that'll be so critical. So I point that out. Yep, and perfect. We can go to the next slide here on page 31. Corresponding slide, the fund balance. If there is one financial measurement that you'll find in audits and that outside rating agencies or lenders look at first and foremost to go measure the financial strength and financial health of a local government, it's your fund balance. And so what you see here from that 2018 time period, really the low point in terms of our reserves, we'll sometimes interchangeably use those reserves and fund balance terms, but speaking about the same thing. If 2018 was the absolute low, you've seen a very nice upward progression from especially 21, 22, and 23. We have at the bottom of the page here a breakout. This is all per your audit. Of the various categories of fund balance that you see there, the unassigned is really the most important. And so we're going to talk about, on the next couple pages, putting in place a policy, now that we have that rebuilt, to make sure that we protect and safeguard that unassigned fund balance into the future. It's a policy that many, if not all of your peers also have in the same range that we'll recommend to you. And so we just want to point that out. Point out one more thing in the details here, the restricted line item there. You see that's growing between 21, 22, and 23. That's some of those dollars that are from the 1% sales tax for schools. So that's kind of where that's tracked. That obviously can only be used for schools' capital, so we kind of think about that in a different bucket. So it's really unassigned portion of that fund balance that we're focused on for this discussion. So again, page 32, why is that fund balance so important? It provides most importantly, provides your day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month cash flow and liquidity. You as a county used to be in a once-a-year real estate tax collection cycle. That was part of what caused some of the challenges in the past years with the cash flow. Moving beyond that, I think has been very helpful, at least as we understand it, to managing your month-to-month and week-to-week cash flows. But that's first and foremost what that fund balance is there for. It's also there for natural disasters. Certainly we get surprises sometimes, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's a facility that has a major problem, you want to make sure you have the dollars in hand in reserve in the case you get that surprise, so we aren't reliant on having to go to outside lenders in order to access that funding. And it also just gives you a lot of flexibility as you're thinking about, maybe in this, we'll call it phase 2 cycle, maybe some needed pent-up capital needs. Having some of the fund balance there in the bank, no different than maybe in your personal finances. At some point, you're going to have to fix the roof. At some point, you're going to have to fix the air conditioning, leaky faucets, whatever it is. Having pent-up reserves to responsibly take care of those, maybe with some borrowing, is a much better situation than having to rely entirely on the credit card to take care of some of those needed improvements. And so we see you sort of out of the woods there, but want to make sure we put in place some policies to underscore it. I think we can flip the page. So to that end, what this is showing us is a trend of, going back the last 10 years at this point, our unassigned fund balance, that portion of the fund balance is arguably the most important, relative to the size of our budget or our expenditures. And so we like to, and it's best practice, the policies that most of your peers would have, to have a policy in place that says we're going to have a minimum amount of fund balance in any given year, but make sure we set that relative to the size of our budget, because that budget is going to grow and adapt year over year. So if you look at the graph at the top of the page, we're showing that as a percentage, which is how we'd recommend tracking it. You go back to 2013, we were in and around 15%, and then we get to 17, 18, and 19, the real low time period, we were below 10%, and that's where the real day-to-day and call it week-to-week cash flow was really a challenge and at risk. Fast forward, we're now in the 20+% range, which is a much healthier range. We'll show you in the next couple of pages, compared to your peers, it's solid, but it's not outsized, meaning it's not way above anybody else, but it's very much in the range of what the rest of your peers are doing. The other thing I'll point out on this page is we've got that red box there. As we talk about a policy, and as you work through your FY25 budget process, that's basically in that 15 to 20% range is where we would recommend that we, meaning you as a board, set that policy going forward to make sure that that unassigned doesn't drop below that 15 to 20% range. If we can get to 20, that's better. The higher the number, the stronger. I think you'll see many of your peers are in the 15+% range in terms of these policies. And so just wanted to give you that sense of things as we look at that. Again, flipping to page 34 here, on a comparative basis, I kind of mentioned this on the prior page, if we're right now at about 22% in terms of that unassigned fund balance, the peer group is about 19%. So we're right in the range there. You can see on the high side, the Buchanans and Carrolls, Giles, et cetera. In the upper 20s, the Russells and Wises a little bit lower. Giles was a great example. They were, a number of years ago, worked closely with the folks in Giles. They were really low on the fund balance side, and it was a big challenge for them. And they have since really worked to get that up to that range, and it's really allowed them to do a lot more capital investment than they were able to in the prior 5 or 10 years. So there is a correlation there to the flexibility to get some more things done if we have some more fund balance and have preserved it that way. So with that, we'll move to the debt profile for the general fund. And by this, we mean the general fund and the schools together. The debt that is tax supported in terms of the county. And so if we flip the page here, we'll give you some more breakouts, but Patrick County has about $29.7 million of outstanding debt. That's all fixed rate. It all basically looks like a mortgage versus a credit card, meaning it's paid in fixed annual principal installments. We'll show you the payout of that. And so it doesn't grow unless you as a board proactively go out and borrow some dollars. And it really is only growing to the extent that you're borrowing to make an investment in capital projects. We have strong ratios in terms of what we call our debt metrics. Similar to fund balance, we have a couple recommendations for you on the debt side of the equation in order to put in place some policies to give us some good governors and roadmaps. And we'll show you those too in the next couple pages. So on page 37, I mentioned here's just a visual picture of the outstanding tax-supported debt. The dark blue there is the principal portion of it. The light blue is the interest portion of it. You will notice that the principal is much greater than the interest, so the interest is by and large very attractive. You have good interest rates. We watch that over time. You've been able to refinance, and we did a little bit of that in the 18-19 time period. So as rates evolve, to the extent there's an opportunity to refinance for savings, we're keeping an eye on that. We don't see anything in the immediate future, but certainly we watch that closely. Because certainly if you can go refinance for savings purposes, no different than your mortgage, that's just a win all the way around. But basically the payments on it, very similar to a mortgage, are level for about the next 10, 12 years. So right at about $2.6, $2.7 million a year, we're kind of set in at that level. We do get some decline out into 37 and 38. We're basically about level here for the foreseeable future in terms of thinking about building a budget and thinking about making any future investments. So on page 38, we call this page the key debt ratios, but these are really a couple ratios that as you work through the budget process, we'd recommend putting in place as policies very similar to the fund balance side. So the first is debt versus assessed value. What that's really measuring is the outstanding amount of what we call tax-supported debt, or that debt that is supported by the general fund, relative to the size of the tax base. Just a good measurement of how many dollars do we have outstanding relative to our biggest revenue source. The second line item here, second policy we'd recommend, is arguably the more important, although they're all important, is debt service to expenditure. So that's basically a ratio that says how many pennies out of every dollar in the budget are going to make a debt service payment. We'll show you what that ratio looks like right now. You're on the low side, but it's basically a way to measure and make sure that we aren't putting too much burden on the annual budget in terms of debt service payments, and gives us an upward governor in terms of we don't want any more than this. We'll show you what that looks like. The third is what we call a 10-year payout ratio. That's basically just measuring how quickly do we pay off the outstanding amount of debt. You have a strong 10-year payout ratio right now, which basically just measures how quickly we do pay off the principal portion. It's a governor to make sure we're not pushing things too far off into the future, so the future generations are having to pay for too much of the burden. So as we flip the page, the first one we'll talk about is tax-supported debt versus assessed value. You can see at the bottom there, we right now are at about 1.5%. That's a low level, meaning strong, good. As you go forward, we could think about a policy range anywhere in we said for the moment 4 to 5%. We could probably even inch that down a smidge depending upon what we think, what really you think your capital needs look like going forward. But you're in a very strong position relative to that ratio as we sit here right now. In terms of your peers, we are above that peer group median, but this particular ratio can vary a lot depending upon where folks are in their capital investment cycle. So Wise had to do a fair amount of schools, courthouse, etc. Floyd's in a similar situation. Tazewell we know well, and they're talking about schools right now. So it kind of depends upon where you are as a county in that capital reinvestment cycle in terms of where that particular ratio is. The debt service to expenditures here, mentioned this on the prior slide. This again is how many pennies out of the budget are going to make a debt service payment. We right now are at about 4%. So that kind of translates to, roughly speaking, about 4 pennies out of every dollar in your budget are going to make a debt service payment. That's on the low side of things. You could arguably have a policy anywhere in the 8 to 10% range and still be viewed very, very strongly. And this tends to be most folks' governor in terms of the outstanding amount of debt relative to those two policies. This tends to be what I'll call maybe the limiting factor. On a comparative basis, we're right now at about 4%. And again, you can see other folks anywhere in the 1 to 5% range, a pretty wide disparity there, just depending upon where folks are in that, call it, capital reinvestment cycle. And so with that, we'll touch a little bit on water and sewer. So I think we flip the page here. It's obviously a critical component by virtue of the PSA to economic development. And so we're going to make sure we highlighted that here today. In terms of overview, operating revenues have been growing about 8% the last several years. Expenditures have been growing about 6%, maybe 6.5%. So you've seen a nice trend there where revenues have been growing faster than expenditures. Reserve levels have increased. And so similar theme on water and sewer as we talked about in the general fund, having some of those built-in reserves is critical to the capital planning, the financial planning. Also clearly on the water and sewer side, to the extent there's a water main break, to the extent a pump goes down, the more you're able to have some good reserves in the bank, the more you're able to take care of that internally, as opposed to have to look externally to maybe the general fund or an outside lender to fix some of those things that inevitably will break on a water and sewer system. So page 45 here just show you that history in terms of revenues versus expenditures. We've had a nice history here in terms of the water and sewer system whereby the expenditures have been greater than the revenues. That's a trend that you want to see. The term that you will hear with water and sewer is it's accounted for as an enterprise fund, and so enterprise meaning a business. Water and sewer for local governments is intended to be run like a business, meaning the users of the system are paying for the system. And so to date, you have that situation, which is a good thing, knowing that it's relatively modest in terms of size, and the county certainly is helping out in certain ways with the debt, et cetera, on the water and sewer side. So similar to the general fund, a couple of recommendations in terms of policies you could put in place on water and sewer. They would have the exact same goals as the general fund, meaning make sure we keep a certain amount of reserves as a contingency against all the potential surprises that you could have. And so in this case, we call that days cash on hand. That's just kind of the industry jargon. It really just means having reserves relative, meaning sized relative to the size of the budget. And so something in that 300 days would be very strong. We'll flip the page. You can see where you've been during the last 5 years. On the right-hand side, the policy recommendation is in that red line. You can see we're above that right now relative to the 300 days at about 600 days. So what that really means is we have about 2 years worth of reserves in the bank on the water and sewer side of things. But I think the other critical point here is just the relative dollars. So if you look at the number of dollars, about $192,000, you think about the cost of repairing mains that break and pumps that go down and things of that variety, whether it's in Patrick County or Fairfax County, those things are expensive. And so having a certain amount of dollars in the bank to cover those types of unexpected expenditures we think is really important, and just want to make that point here. So our last section, and then happy to take any questions or comments that the board or anyone may have. This is our capital funding analysis. So again, knowing that you're in the budget cycle, kind of the planning cycle and mindset, wanted to give you an order of magnitude in terms of what the impact would be to the extent you as a board go forward with some capital projects. And for the moment, we just gave it in some rough ranges, not to say these are exact figures, just wanted to give you kind of a picture. And so we've run 3 different scenarios. The first scenario 1 is if a $5 million investment were made in terms of capital. So plus or minus, that might be an emergency management building. Again, just trying to give a little bit of a corollary to the dollar amount and the specific type of projects. But I think this will all get fleshed out as you work through your budget planning cycle. Scenario 2, if the investment were $10 million, which might correspond roughly to an emergency management and maybe some renovations to the county administration building. And then scenario 3, a larger, on the $25 million side, what might that look like? Again, just to give you an order of magnitude. So if we flip the page, we've run a variety of different sort of variables as we looked at that. You see it there in A and B. So the A scenarios, you'll see all of those investments, whether it's 5, 10, or 25, assume a 20-year borrowing at 5%. Just good planning numbers. The B scenarios assume a 30-year borrowing at 5.5%. So for long-term investments, whether it's new facilities, investments to existing facilities, anywhere in that 20 to 30-year range tends to be pretty typical for a borrowing of that type. You're typically making investments that'll be around for multiple decades, multiple generations. And so you have that concept of what we sometimes call intergenerational equity, whereby if a facility is going to be around and benefit taxpayers in the future, kind of allowing them to pay for it over time versus burdening them all today. I'll make one other point here in that those two interest rates are above the current market, so we try and plan on the more conservative side. So we're probably in the 4%, maybe a little bit less in terms of current market rates. We've tried to build a little bit of contingency in there using 5 to 5.5%, just to kind of give you that sense and be on the more conservative side of things. The third bullet point here, and then I'll show you the next couple pages, we've equated the additional dollars needed in terms of new revenues to pay for these various scenarios to the real estate tax rate. That is not to say that you as a board need to go out and necessarily raise the real estate tax rate, and it's not to say that that's the only revenue source you have. You've got a variety of different revenue sources, but it does tend to be that is maybe at the forefront of everyone's mind during the budget planning cycle, and it's also your biggest revenue source in terms of what you as a board have at your discretion for new revenues. So I just want to make sure that we make that clear, that as we talk about the impact to the real estate tax rate, we're really just trying to give you a direct corollary to what that looks like in the budget. So as we go to page 51 here, again, the 3 different scenarios. You can see their project size of $5 million, of $10 million, and of $25 million, assuming a 5% interest rate. I'll take you first to there's 2 yellow boxes there, approximate annual payment. So scenario 1, if we were to borrow $5 million as a county, repaid over 20 years at 5%, that's about $400,000 a year in terms of the annual payment, assuming a 20-year payback. You take your eye to the right, scenario 2, if you go to a $10 million investment, that goes to about $800,000, a little bit more. The math there works pretty sequentially. And then all the way to scenario 3, that $25 million equates to about $2 million a year. I think realistically, we've run these pretty high level. What likely ends up happening is you take off sort of bites at a time, meaning if you were to work through something like a facility study, understand what the priorities and needs are, the timing and staging of the investments and what you need to spend and what you want to spend would get worked in over time. So it's unlikely that you would see necessarily all of that impact at once. There's ways, especially in this environment, where designing things and then bidding them and then ultimately constructing them takes a long time. And so I'll just also point that out in terms of the timing of this is also important. We've just given you a very high level for the moment. We flip the page. at 5.5% over 30 years, a little bit longer time period to repay that. You can see the annual payments, they're a little bit lower, no different than if you've got a 20-year mortgage versus a 30-year mortgage. A 30-year mortgage gets you a lower payment, 20-year mortgage a little bit higher payment, but ultimately the 20-year pays it off faster. And so that's kind of the balancing act that you can look at and think about going forward. And knowing that you're, as a county, at maybe the early stages of thinking about some of the things, and certainly in the midst of the budget process, something else that we would think about, to the extent there are some needs that you need to do in the short run, is to put in place what we call interim financing. And so before you get to the point of going out and doing a long-term permanent financing, there's inevitably the need to do design and architectural drawings. Maybe there's equipment that needs to be purchased, et cetera. And so owing to that timing side of things, using some interim financing can help kind of bridge the gap between what may be a need to engineer and design projects, and then might be 12, 18 months later before you actually start construction. That can conserve your fund balance, and so we've talked a lot about that. Another point that I'll make here in this environment is that you can earn, via even just a state program, 5+% on your fund balance. And in terms of borrowing rates, if you're in and around the 4% range, you're actually earning more on your cash in the bank than you can go out and borrow for right now. And so in addition to conserving the fund balance, there's actually call it an interest rate benefit to using some of those tax-exempt borrowed dollars, which the county has the ability to do, and conserving that fund balance in the bank. Again, to the extent, which I think is the case at the moment, maybe there's some preliminary design, engineering, architectural kind of studies that need to be done before you actually go and do any construction. So we just point that out as a potential option for you. The other advantage is it has less of an upfront impact on the budget. And so running some numbers here in terms of what would it look like at a $5 or $10 million amount in terms of interim financing, and ultimately what you see is a lower impact on the budget than if we went straight into permanent financing. And so with that, the rest, we've got a variety of appendices and supporting materials and all the other stuff that we have to put back there. So, Mr. Chair, members of the board, I would say anything you want to highlight or anything I skipped in there that you want to focus on? And so with that, Mr. Chair, I'd happy to answer any questions, any thoughts, comments that you may have. We certainly appreciate the time.
Does anybody have any questions?
This time. Not this time.
Mr. Wood, you have? I guess we're good at the moment. I appreciate the presentation and a lot of helpful, good ideas in there too.
Thank you. Thank you. We certainly appreciate it. We know you're sort of at the beginning part of that budget process, and so to the extent there's questions, thoughts as you kind of work through it, we're certainly here as a resource to you. Appreciate it. All right.
I'll just say, as somebody 4 months into this and not really knowing what was going to come out of this, when I went to meet with y'all in November, I guess.
Yeah, that's right there.
I was very excited when we got the presentation, I guess sometime last week. The staff, the board, done good work over the last 4 or 5 years, and I think this proves that. So just excited to see that and excited to see what's next. So thank you to everybody who's been part of getting us back on the right track.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
All right. So I move that the board convene in closed meeting pursuant to Virginia Code Section 2.23711A1 to discuss and consider the following. Department of Social Services for Peters Creek, the term expires December 2027. Department of Social Services for the Smith River District, that term expires December of 2026. Planning Commission, Peters Creek, term expires January 2028. The Economic Development Authority for Dan River, and the term expires August of 2025. And pursuant to the Virginia Code Section 2.2 3711A3, discussion of the acquisition of real property for public purpose where the discussion in open meeting would adversely affect the board's bargaining position or negotiating strategy.
Have a motion, do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second, call vote, Mr. Marshall?
Aye.
Mr. Kendry?
Aye.
Mr. Wood?
Aye.
Mr.